right, hi everyone, good evening. I'd like to welcome you to our talk tonight on behalf of the Iowa Public Policy Center. My name is Tracy Osborn. I'm an associate professor in the political science department and the director of the politics and policy section at the PPC. So as part of our Fork and Brock series, we like to bring people in to do talks about current activities. And I don't know, you may have seen the Arnold Schwarzenegger video making the rounds about gerrymandering on Facebook or whatever. If you haven't, I would YouTube it. It's entertaining. But I think that alone says that this is an issue that people are paying attention to, in the run-up to the 2018 and 2020 elections. So we're really excited that tonight we have two speakers about gerrymandering. So I'm going to introduce our speakers on my phone because I'm tacky and I need notes. And then we're going to have them both speak to us a little bit about the consequences and the system of gerrymandering. And then we'll have plenty of time for audience questions. So if you're interested in asking a question to the speakers, I'll take questions after they talk. All right, so to introduce our speakers, beginning from the left here, we have David Daley. David is the former editor-in-chief of Salon Media, and he is the author of Rat F-worded. It auto-corrected to rat trucked on my phone, so we'll use that. The true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy. And then to his left, we have John Winburn, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Mississippi and the director of the social science research lab there. So David's going to be our first speaker. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. This is beautiful. Iowa is a special place, so it's nice to come talk about this. Whenever I'm asked for solutions to the redistricting crisis, I like to talk about the civic culture of this state, how Iowa is a redistricting unicorn in so many ways with competitive districts because the voters in this state value it and won't tolerate monkeying with fair play and electoral norms. So it's a privilege to be with you and to be here. Our topic today is whether gerrymandering has polarized America. In some ways, this is a classic political science chicken and egg. It's a hard question to answer definitively. We've had gerrymandering for 250 years. We've had a hardening partisanship in this country for many decades. Allow me to suggest that in our modern politics, they work in tandem, one accelerating the other. And I'd like to try to illustrate this by posing a simple question, one that has probably been on the minds of a lot of us in recent divisive and uncharted days, and that is, how did we get here? How is it possible for a closely divided country, which has favored the Democrats in the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 elections, to be dominated so thoroughly by the Republicans on the state, local, and legislative levels? How did we leave Election Day 2016 with Republicans dominating 69 of 99 legislative chambers, both houses in 35 states, including now here in Iowa, a modern record of 33 governors and trifectas, both houses and the governor's office in 25 states? If we are as closely divided and polarized as it seems we are, why is it that every time we flip a coin, it ends up landing on the elephant side and not on the donkey? My argument is that we are here because in 2010, savvy Republican strategists managed to reinvent the oldest political trick in the book, the gerrymander, in a thoroughly modern and audacious new way. The gerrymandering game, of course, has been mastered by both parties, politicians of all stripes, sometimes in cahoots with one another, ever since Patrick Henry tried to use district lines to defeat the hated James Madison back in 1788. But in 2010 and 2011, there's a confluence of political will, dark money, and rapid technological advancement that has contributed to the serious challenges our democracy faces today. Helped by new powerful map-making software and all-knowing data sets which can surgically craft district lines, bankrolled by a flood of anonymous dollars after the Citizens United decision, buoyed by rising partisanship, but endangered by demographic trends in a divided country, the Republicans plotted their return to power after Barack Obama's 2008 sweep through redistricting. It worked. We are an uncompetitive nation at the legislative level, and the gerrymander is at the root of it. This has had dramatic and unforeseen consequences for our politics, which have become more extreme, more polarizing, and more dangerously more insulated from the ballot box than perhaps at any time in our history. Our democracy has been rewired at its most basic level, the lines of our legislative districts. It goes a long way to explaining why our politics feel so broken and why it is so very hard to fix. The center, an endangered species for so long, has been vaporized with the click of a mapmaker's mouse, has been drawn away, gutting in many ways the very principles of representative democracy. The position we find ourselves in is not a coincidence, but you don't have to take my word for it. The Republican Party did not launch this plan in secret. To the contrary, they announced it. Karl Rove telegraphed REDMAP, an apt acronym for the Redistricting Majority Project, in a March 2010 op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. I want to read from it briefly because he mentions specific neighborhoods in small towns, Brushy Creek in Round Rock, Texas, Murraysville Township in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, as crucial to down-ballot elections that could determine control of Congress for the next decade. And he introduces a newly muscular organization called the Republican State Leadership Committee as its leader. Rove writes, there are 18 state legislative chambers that have 4 or fewer seats separating the two parties that are important for redistricting. 7 of these controlled by the Republicans, the other 11 controlled by the Democrats, including lower houses in Ohio, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. Republican strategists are focused on 107 seats in 16 states. Winning those state seats, would give them control of drawing district lines for nearly 190 congressional seats. This plan is executed so well that the only word Rove gets wrong is nearly. After Election Day 2010, Republicans would control the drawing of 193 of the 435 congressional seats. Democrats would have complete control over 44. Independent commissions would control 88. That's a dramatic reversal from the previous decade that had favored Democrats 135 to 98, with 161 seats under bipartisan control. So back in 2010, National Public Radio says that there are 70 competitive districts on the congressional level left in the country. After this election, Republicans controlled how 47 of those 70 lines would be drawn. Democrats just 15. Perhaps it's no coincidence then that by 2016, the Cook Political Report has identified only 37 competitive districts. 33 of them are gone over the span of 6 years. Indeed, the Republican State Leadership Committee's very pitch to their big money donors promised not only to lock in GOP majorities, but also to wipe these expensive swing districts off the table completely. This is how you nullify the center and advance your agenda in a 50-50 polarized world. When we are as polarized as this, where you draw the lines becomes the most essential element when it comes to controlling legislative bodies. If voters are this polarized, winning depends on how you distribute them. So this is how National Journal can find 137 congressional centrists in 2002, but by 2012, just 4. It's how Nate Silver can find that the number of landslide districts, just completely non-competitive districts, over that same period of time goes from 123 to 242. And it's why when you look at Congress today, you don't see anyone like Jim Leach with the ability to cross the aisle, find compromise, and play the role of party conscience. How did this work? Credit a strategist named Chris Jankowski at the RSLC with the idea. He realized that 2008 represented a big Democratic wave. But he also realized that the truly important election was going to come in 2010, because as we know, the Constitution mandates the redistricting of every state legislative and congressional district every 10 years after the census. Elections held in years ending in 0 simply mean more. They can reverberate out across the next decade. He also realizes that while every state has got a little bit of a different strategy around this, in about 80% of all of these states, the legislature plays the key role in redistricting. His strategy was so simple and elegant that it's amazing no one had hit on it in quite this way before. Target relatively inexpensive state house and senate districts nationwide with the goal of flipping legislative chambers and controlling the redistricting process in as many states as possible, then draw themselves friendly districts that lock in these gains, even in blue states and purple states, for the next 10 years. This is in many ways the greatest political heist in modern American history. Jankowski and the Republican Party would spend $30 million on Red Map. New Hampshire's Senate race in 2016 caught that much. For $30 million, the Republicans bought a hammerlock on the House for a decade, and just as important, huge supermajorities in blue and purple state legislatures like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Florida. Also, of course, the swing states that put Donald Trump over the top. That $30 million was spent knocking out Democratic legislatures at the hyper-local level. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of negative ads dumped into state house and Senate races over the last several weeks of the 2010 campaign, most of it against legislators who never saw it coming and did not have the means to respond. About $1 million in a handful of key Ohio state races, giving the Republicans complete control over that state and 16 congressional seats. Another $1 million in Michigan, flipped both chambers there, bringing in another 148 legislative districts and 14 congressional seats. Pennsylvania, another $1 million, brought veto-proof control over redistricting. Similar successful efforts in Wisconsin, North Carolina, Texas, Florida, Alabama. The following year, they pressed the advantage. In Ohio, Republican strategists barricade themselves into a suite at the Doubletree for months. They call it the bunker. They tell no one where they are. And together with strategists from the Republican National Committee and then Speaker John Boehner's political team, devised new lines based on complicated mathematical algorithms. In Wisconsin, operatives connected to Paul Ryan locked themselves in a law firm across the street from the Capitol. They claim attorney-client privilege for the work they are doing, will not even show the districts to incumbent legislators who have not signed confidentiality agreements. North Carolina, you've got a master mapmaker named Tom Hofeller who arrives. He treats redistricting like it's espionage. He gives colleagues a presentation warning them never to send public emails, not to leave their computers visible, most importantly, not to fire the staff until they're sure they're done. In Florida, strategists conspire an end run around a new state constitutional amendment mandating nonpartisan redistricting by running a secret shadow redistricting process and funneling maps through phony emails and interns without their knowledge. They might have gotten away with the clandestine operation, except that a lawsuit brought by reformers uncovered the meeting's agendas. Questions like communication with outside non-lawyers, how can we make that work? A furious federal judge in 2014 declared several of these districts unconstitutional and ordered new maps in light of this, quote, conspiracy to manipulate and influence redistricting that, quote, made a mockery of transparency and tainted the process with improper partisan intent. Flash forward to 2012, Barack Obama's reelected, Democrats take the Senate, and more Democratic candidates, 1.4 million more votes for Democratic House candidates nationwide than Republicans. But in the first election run on these new maps, the firewall holds. This is really dramatic on the state level. The Republican advantage in the House of Representatives is 234-201 at the end of the 2012 election, despite those 1.4 million more votes. In Michigan, House Democrats take 240,000 more seats. Republicans take 9 of the 14 seats. Republicans win a supermajority in the State House in Iowa despite fewer votes, and 12 of the 16 congressional seats. In Pennsylvania, Democrats win 100,000 more votes, which is 5 of the 18 seats. North Carolina, Democratic State House candidates take more votes than Republicans. The Republicans take a veto-proof supermajority, and U.S. House candidates take 10 of the 13 seats. State after state after state, the maps produce just the results the Republicans imagine. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. The Republicans issue an annual report for Red Map after 2012, crediting Redistricting for holding their red line intact. Or you can look at it like this. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, those are all states that go for Barack Obama in 2012. This is a deeply partisan presidential election, which sees the fewest split ballots in almost 100 years. Those states cumulatively send to Washington 47 Republicans and 20 Democrats. Add Florida and North Carolina to that list, it's 73-34. That's more than 2-1, not reflective of the state vote. There are those who will argue that this is about geography, about the big sort, about Democrats clustering in big cities, giving Republicans a natural advantage. That kind of analysis, I think, becomes largely outdated after what happens in 2010. If you dig in deeper in Pennsylvania, in 2008 and 2012, Democratic House candidates in both of those years win by an aggregate advantage of about 100,000 votes. In 2008, that equates to 12 of 19 seats. In 2012, it's 5 of 18 seats. You could call it geography, but that would mean that all of those Democratic voters decided to move towards new places in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. What actually changed over the course of those 4 years? The lines. It's the same thing in Michigan. Similar aggregate vote wins in 2008 and 2012. Democrats carry it in 2008, Republicans in 2012, regardless of the aggregate vote. The real difference between these elections is the lines that they are run on. We have been big sorted by big technology. Gerrymandering from 1790 until 2000, it's the minor leagues of gerrymandering. In 2010, it jumps straight into its steroids era. Determined partisan map makers have access to volumes of census data, voting records, precinct block level, down ballot results, and reams of consumer preferences, as well as powerful computer programs that can instantly calculate the likely result of moving a district line, a block in any direction. Every one of those funny, funky lines has a purpose. Today's map makers can easily calculate algorithms designed to withstand electoral waves. It's the data, the technology, and the ease with which it can be manipulated that make the post-2010 redistricting cycle fundamentally different from any other. Partisan gerrymandering has always been a partisan weapon. It's the technology that makes it so much more lethal. The data sets in our hardened partisanships make our voting tendencies easier to determine. Mix that in with a sophisticated political strategy, and you have a recipe for turning the side with fewer votes into a supermajority. The dangers that you begin to see are how just about every year, every election cycle under these maps, what you're beginning to see is the number of non-contested seats rising. It's up to the point now that 43% of all state legislative seats in the country do not have a major party challenger. This was around 31% in 2010, so it has climbed in 12, climbed in 14, climbed in 16. That this election did not lack for fervor. In North Carolina, you had Immoral Monday protests, and you had folks out in the streets over activities by a supermajority legislature that seems insulated at the ballot box. And yet 57 of the 120 state House seats did not have a major party challenger because people take a look at these lines and they say, I can't win here. It's the same thing in Wisconsin, where 49 of 99 of the assembly seats in 2016 went uncontested. When there is no choice, when we cease to have competitive elections and contests of ideas, when parties can't find candidates because they believe they have no chance to win, we cease to have a functioning democracy. When you look at the results though, it's easy to understand why no one wants to run in these districts. Ohio is a great example. Again, it's a bellwether, as we know, a passionate political state known for its swings. Yet this past year, of the 87 contested state house races, not a single one of them was within 5%. 5 of those races were within 10%, but more than half of them were decided by 30%. In Michigan, for the 3rd cycle in a row in the 5th of 6th elections, Democratic state house candidates got more votes. Republicans maintained their supermajority. In 2016 in Wisconsin as well, Republicans add to their assembly supermajority despite essentially splitting the vote. Gerrymandering has solidified Republican control of the states. It could also now bake in a lock on the Electoral College. There's a growing movement afoot to change state laws to reallocate electoral votes by congressional districts. Donald Trump again lost the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, but he won 230 of the 435 congressional districts. Again, Mitt Romney in 2012 won 224 of these and would have defeated Barack Obama if you'd used this standard. This is why Virginia, Minnesota, and New Hampshire have been talking since the 2016 race. There are new bills in each of those states to award electoral votes proportionally. Similar plans were floated after 2012 in Virginia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The states all sound familiar. I know that this sounds dire, so let me try to offer a little hope. These maps, one by one, are being deemed unconstitutional by federal judges, either on racial or partisan gerrymandering grounds. In Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Maryland, these maps are taking a beating. The Wisconsin maps, which in 2012 produced 60 Republican seats of 99, despite more Democratic votes, have been ordered redrawn in time for the next election. Florida and Virginia in 2016 had several new court-ordered congressional redraws, and they led to more competitive and representative elections. The Wisconsin case, meanwhile, holds the hope for a Supreme Court ruling on partisan gerrymandering, which could be the first time that the court actually finds a standard that would determine when a partisan gerrymander goes too far. It's aimed squarely at Justice Anthony Kennedy, who has indicated his openness to such a standard in previous decisions. This groundbreaking litigation has created small steps towards fairer maps. President Obama and former Attorney General Holder have awakened from the Democrats' 2010 slumber and are leading a drive aimed at flipping chambers in their direction for 2020. If they raise awareness of the importance of this issue, that's a terrific thing. But a blue map play based on flipping chambers, that is a real long shot. If you look at these same states we keep talking about, Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, they are out of play electorally. In 2016, Democrats targeted 32 seats in those key states and won just 8 of them. Meanwhile, Republicans expanded their leads in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. With 2 cycles left, that is a deep, deep hole to dig out of. The more realistic electoral strategy would be focusing on governor's races in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Florida, Wisconsin, where the governor has veto power over maps and would at least give both parties a seat at the table. Nevertheless, it's not really reform. It makes our politics more toxic, more expensive, all the way down to the district level. The bottom line, I'd say, is this. A Frankenstein monster got unleashed in our politics in 2010. The Republicans guaranteed themselves control of Congress, but they also generated a Republican caucus that they could not control. We've created 400 plus of 435 districts where there is no true competition outside of the party primary. Members from these districts need only guard their base, compromise, governing, seeking common ground. All of the things that are central to the art of politics are the very things that threaten their livelihood. Uncompetitive districts make the government responsive only to the extremes. They are the reason we can't get action on issues where the great center agrees, and they are the reason why in state after state and now in Congress, an agenda that a majority of Americans did not vote for has clear sailing. The founders designed the House of Representatives to be the piece of the federal government that is most responsive to the will of the citizens. Instead, through gerrymandering, it has become insulated from voters. When we have so few districts that matter, Our representatives essentially become chosen by a small percentage of an activist base. It changes the tone and tenor of our politics, means no one tries the art of persuasion, and sends to Washington politicians with little interest in compromising and governing. We are the only democracy in the world that allows politicians to choose their voters. We want our votes to count. We want elections to matter. But when our democratic institutions become separated from the popular will to this extent, they cease to become effective. And it does call into question the very notion of the House as a mirror of popular views. I say this not as a partisan, but as someone who thinks government works best when we elect people who want to come together sincerely at the table to work out solutions for serious and complicated problems, and as someone who thinks democracy functions best when the side with the most votes wins, whichever side that may be. I am sorry that I don't have a happier ending. It will take a lot of work to write one ourselves, but it is in many ways an expansion of the Iowa model, not necessarily a replication of your unique system, but a replication of the small d democratic values that it protects and the civic culture you all insist upon and rightfully treasure. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to start my timer here because I can sometimes go a little long on this. Okay. All right, that's going to be my other challenge. I'm used to roaming around when I lecture, so I'll try to stay here close. Let me start by saying that thank you all for having me here. I'm always excited to come talk about this. And basically, I agree with everything David just said. I think his story, by and large, that's what's happened, and that's what went on in 2010, and the Republicans did in some way, a wonderful job of drawing districts to help themselves. So what I want to talk about tonight then is add a little bit of the academic research view on this, and then talk a little bit about some of the other issues that I think emerged from this, and offer you my sort of low-tech reform that could help on this. And up front, there's no perfect solution to stopping gerrymandering. There's no sort of magic cure for it. So I want to just sort of go through a couple of different topics on this. So I may jump around just a little bit. But let me start with just a couple of quotes here. One, let's see, coming up here. Redistricting may be the single least interesting word in the English language. I have this up in my office to remind me of the unimportance of my own research. No. And it's also good to see people out to show that this isn't the case. But in some ways, I think this quote highlights the fact that traditionally this is something that's happened behind closed doors. The public doesn't know much about it. They don't care much about it. So it's a way that the politicians have been able to really control this process. And then the second quote is to highlight how it's not uninteresting, and the fact that I didn't want David, the only one to get to use the F word. We're going to shove the district map up your effing ass, and you're going to like it, and I'll F any Republican I can. This is from a Democratic county commissioner in Illinois back in the 2000s, referring to the local commissioners' maps. So this isn't just a congressional issue. This goes across local, state, up to Congress, the issues that we're talking about here. And I'll also note that a lot of my research is on state legislatures and Congress as well, so I'm kind of mixing both of that here tonight as I talk about this. All right, so in sort of what David was talking about, some of our big concerns with this is that redistricting is the main cause of polarization, right? Is that we've drawn districts that have moved the parties further left and right, and that polarization is the result of this. So these are some of the main conventional views of what the consequences of redistricting really is. Another quote, David's highlighted this from the 2010 round. This goes back, this isn't a new phenomenon either, is that, districts are being created that are so safe, they're not competitive, they're not changing hands, they're not up in the air, and that's leading to this increasing polarization of politics. And then I think the broader concern is highlighted by this quote, is that you didn't choose your legislators, they chose you. And that the bigger fear, I think, is that the system looks broken. It looks rigged. It looks like that the people don't really have any control over this. And in a lot of ways, that's what I'm more concerned about, and less concerned about who actually wins and loses on election day. But it's because we want to have systems that we can trust in, that we can put trust into, that we believe are fair. So that's where a lot of my approach comes from on this. And I'll sort of highlight that at the end as I go. So setting this up, that redistricting is this root evil of polarization, now for a little dose of the academic literature that basically says, yeah, no. By and large, the academic literature would suggest that redistricting, that polarization is basically happening outside of the redistricting process. Some of my own research has highlighted this, where we did a study that basically shows that, and what do we mean by polarization here? Mainly the academic research is focused on legislative polarization and some measure of how often do the Democrats and Republicans vote together, how often do they vote, completely apart? Do you see legislators sort of voting across the aisle, sort of bipartisan votes, that type of thing. And most of the academic literature would say that polarization is occurring and it's not really redistricting's fault. Some of my research shows that even in states that use even independent commissions, or the maps are drawn outside the legislature's hands, that those state legislative chambers are polarizing just as much as states where the maps are drawn by the legislators themselves. A study that just came out, I think in December, basically shows that independent commissions have more polarization than other methods within their state legislatures, basically confirming our earlier study. There's been other studies that show that if you do a lot of simulations with neutral methods and legislative drawn methods, that polarization looks about the same. And then I think sort of outside of all of that is if you look at the U.S. Senate, it's been polarizing at similar rates as the U.S. House over the past 20 years. And of course, there's no redistricting that occurs in the U.S. Senate. So that's sort of the academic, a very brief look at the academic research on this. Now, I would add that I don't think that truly means that redistricting is not a part of this at all. I think redistricting is involved here, but I think it's a part of larger forces that are going on, and we can't just blame it solely on redistricting. Because I think in that way we may be missing some of the bigger picture issues, even though that's often an easy scapegoat, because like I said earlier, the system just looks rigged. It may be rigged as well, but it just looks rigged, and I think that's part of the issue here. I'll also say real quickly here on some of the academic research that the academic research is very mixed on the influence of redistricting on actual election outcomes. We have some studies that show when legislators draw lines, the districts become safer for them. Other studies find that that's not always the case. So it's a mixed bag, let me say it that way, in terms of we don't have a great definitive answer for the exact mechanism for how redistricting affects election day outcomes. But we do have more evidence there that says that yes, they do, or that how the lines are drawn can matter, but it's not always conclusive in the academic research, but that tends to be the case in a lot of questions in academia. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out there, not to suggest that none of this doesn't matter, because I think it definitely matters. The way the lines are drawn, who's drawing them, it definitely matters, but that I don't think it's as simple as just blaming it on redistricting for where we're at in our current state of polarization. So what are some of the other factors going on here? And I'm going to pick on the Republicans for a few minutes because they did, like I said, in one view, a really excellent job of capitalizing on these factors in the past 2 decades to get control of all these states. And David mentioned the idea of the partisan sort, and I do think there is something there. I think the partisan sort matters in this. it's, I think, maybe a little bit more nuanced than a lot of people often think. But I think what has happened over the past 30 years especially is that we've seen often more suburban areas get the population growth, and that has allowed Republicans to come in and have, in some way, an easier time to draw districts because they've got more people to play with in areas where they know that they often have voters that agree with them. And you know, that may have reached its height in the 2000s. You know, we also know on the flip side of this that a lot of rural America is shrinking in population, which often tends to be more Republican as well. So like I said, I think the partisan sword issue is one that matters. But once again, I think it's all part of this complex, interconnected factors that are going on here in a lot of different ways. But I do want to spend just a minute here talking about something that is sometimes ignored in this, and that's the role of racial gerrymandering and how it has inadvertently, I think, helped Republicans and made it easier for Republicans to pick up more seats. You know, a state like Iowa, this doesn't matter, right? There's no diversity. There's no chance to draw a majority-minority district. But I just want to talk about this for just a couple of minutes here. So back in the 1980s, the Supreme Court opened the door for majority-minority districts under the argument that Congress it was probably a good thing to get more diversity in Congress. And they said, okay, one way to try to do this is to allow the drawing of majority-minority districts where you place a majority of a minority population in one district to allow them to elect the representative of their choice. Doesn't mean it has to be a minority representative, but most of the time it is. And we're usually thinking of this in terms of African-American population. There's also Latino majority-minority districts in a few states. And so you really started to see this emerge in the 1990s. And at first, Democrats thought, okay, this is a great way for us to get some seats here because we know African-Americans especially overwhelmingly vote Democratic. And this is a way to get more Democrats in office. But what's happened over the years is unintended consequences. And we've seen, you know, politics makes strange bedfellows, right? We've seen in Arkansas, there was a lawsuit filed by the NAACP and the Republican Party together against the Democrats, saying that the Democrats did not pay enough attention to minority representation. We don't often see the NAACP and the GOP together, you know, on the same side of a lawsuit. But Republicans have figured out that by packing a lot of Democrats into a few number of majority-minority districts, it opens the door to have more Republicans in the surrounding districts. And what's happened, we do have more minority representation in Congress, which is definitely a good thing. But I think the unintended consequence is it's made it easier for Republicans to pick up more seats and made it more difficult for the Democrats to be competitive in a lot of states. I want to show you an example from Mississippi, where I'm coming from here on this. So what I've got here is I've got the county map of Mississippi by percent African American in the county. For those of you not familiar with the geography of Mississippi, basically we've got the Mississippi River there on the left, and that's called the Mississippi Delta, where in these Delta counties they are almost all overwhelmingly majority African American counties, some as high as 80-90% black. And these are the district lines from the 1968 districts, from the 90th Congress. And at this time, if you notice, see my pointer's working here, good, the districts kind of go horizontal across the state, right? And at this time, it was still the Old South, all Democrats all the time. There were no Republicans anywhere in sight. So this wasn't probably not that much of a strategic thing other than the fact to divide up African-American population. Fast forward to today, we've lost a seat, as Iowa has in recent years. But now the districts look kind of vertical, right? Especially this is the first district in Mississippi, Benny Thompson's district, which I believe is, if it does not have the largest African-American population of any congressional districts, it's in the top 2 or 3. So basically what's happened, because of the courts wanted to see an emphasis on majority-minority districts, The Democrats back in the, I think the 1990 round or the 1980s had to flip their districts essentially to guarantee one majority-minority district. Now, in these other 3 districts, there's really no chance for Democrats to win because all the Democrats, or a reliable portion of Democrats, are all packed into this one district. So if the Democrats had their way, they could go back to a map that looks something like this and have a couple of competitive districts in the state, have a couple that they might actually have a chance to win. It's Mississippi in 2017, so probably not, but they would have a better chance than they do in this map. So right now the Democrats are essentially guaranteed 1 seat here. If they could do some version of these older maps, they might have a chance to pick up a 2nd seat occasionally, or at least be consistently competitive. These 3 districts, Democrats don't even bother running. There's no chance. After the old vestiges of the old Southern Democrats got kicked out of office or voted out in 2010, Democrats have pretty much given up on these. So I think I wanted to bring this up, the issue of race, because it's going to be interesting in 2020 with the court ruling in Shelby v. Holder that basically gutted the VRA. Are we going to see big changes to majority-minority districts? My gut says no, because the Republicans are already in power, and they like this setup, right? They're going to tout, oh, look, we want diversity. No, you want to have a few number of minorities that are Democrats, and then the rest of the seats for yourself. So there have been some sort of structural factors that have come together in the past 20 or 30 years that I think in some ways have probably made it easier for the Republicans to capitalize on this new technology and capitalize on drawing districts that benefit themselves. All right, so that's one thing I wanted to talk about. Let me spend a couple of minutes now. Well, just give away my, got a little too fast there. All right, so is there a way that we can create more competitive districts? Some folks argue that using redistricting to create more competitive districts is a good thing. Some states have even tried to put this into their rules, like Arizona. But I would argue, I don't know if that's really any better. I don't know if we should be using redistricting to force electoral outcomes one way or the other. I think the more competition is a more laudable normative goal. It's a good thing by and large, but I'm not sure if that's the answer. If using the system to create or guarantee competitive districts is really much better than what's going on now. So what then? If we can't use the system to create more competitive districts, I think the answer is that we put a focus on a sort of representational link between constituents and who gets elected. The idea that drawing districts in a way that the constituents in the district, the citizens sort of know who represents them, that have an easy way of identifying the representative, I think is one way to think about this. And then you let the electoral chips fall where they may. And I say this in part because of this idea that I'm not sure the average citizen really wants competitive districts. I'm not sure if the average citizen really wants these really fair, open districts because, sort of Lincoln's term, the better angels of our nature. In some ways, I think the better angels of our nature may be partisan. And we've got a study coming out this year that basically shows if you give people the chance to pick districts to live in, they want to live with their co-partisans. So we did an experiment where we showed some districts that people could choose from, and in one, we didn't give them any type of information. We just said, which of these districts do you prefer? And with no partisan information, they want to live in a district with their neighbors. So they want to live so basically what we did is we showed a map that split up a county and said, which of these districts do you prefer? With no information, they want to live in the district with their neighbors. But as soon as you show partisan information, they don't care about their neighbors. They want to be with their partisans. So they will give up living with their neighbors to go live in another district, a district that connects to them, that's more partisan friendly for them. And there's also been another study that just came out that basically shows that people are happy with redistricting when it's their party that draws the lines. So it's one of those things that we don't think it's bad if we're winning, right? So Republicans probably aren't too upset with redistricting right now because they're winning. And it's not that Republicans or that Democrats are sort of care about democracy more or have better goals than this. It's just they're losing, so they can complain about this now, right? But if the shoe was on the other foot, then the Republicans would be upset and the Democrats would be happy. So, in that way, I'm not sure if any type of system that tries to guarantee certain electoral outcomes, either more competitive or whatever, is necessarily the answer. So what is my sort of modest answer to this? And it's sort of a low-tech answer to this sort of new high-tech world of redistricting. And I'm going to show you here, excuse me. Once again, my Iowa map pops up. I'm not just playing to the hometown crowd here, I promise, but I want to show you what I think is a beautiful map, right? This is just a beautiful map, the best map ever. Why do I think this is so beautiful? Well, if you look at these 4 congressional districts, they don't split any counties. All the counties are nice and neat, drawn together in individual districts. Now, I know, once again, Iowa's unique. You've got these nice little rectangular counties by and large. It's a very homogeneous state, so it's easier to do here than other places. But to me, this is the answer, or one of the answers. And just to show you that I'm not just kissing up to you all, here's another example. That's West Virginia, if you don't know. West Virginia did not split any counties either, and there are 3 congressional districts. As you can see here, there's been other states. Arkansas in the past has been able to do this. And, all right, so why do I think that this is a potentially effective way to combat some of these problems? Well, if we go back to the Iowa map here, maybe we will, maybe we won't. All right, let's stick with West Virginia then. If you look at this, there we go, a little slow. You can make some arguments about maybe why is Chickasaw County in the 4th district? Oh, maybe it really should be over here in the 1st. And sure, we could quibble about some of that, and you could argue about that. But if you make the line drawers, whoever it is, the legislative staff, the legislators, an independent commission, a citizen commission like there is in California, follow some of these predetermined rules that are geared towards some, what I think is important, geographic principles, then it could potentially limit a lot of the gerrymandering. Sure, you can make these districts in a lot of different ways and you could get some different outcomes. There's no perfect solution. There's no way to completely stop it. But I think something like this can limit the worst of it, right? We're not going to completely get rid of gerrymandering, but may be able to limit some of the worst aspects of this. And this makes it easier for constituents to know which district they live in, right? Oh, I live in this county. That's who my representative is. Easily look at a map. Now, there are limits to this, right? States that have more urban populations, more racial diversity, this becomes more difficult. But I still think even in those areas, you let the local geography decide, right? In big cities, maybe it's, maybe people think in terms of neighborhoods or blocks or certain areas. You can set criteria that can be effective across the board, I would think, to account for all different sizes and diversity throughout the country. All right, so to recap here what I've just said, so the take-home points, the academic literature says polarization is occurring mostly outside of redistricting and that there's other sort of broader factors going on. I think redistricting has sort of exasperated it in some cases, but there are other things going on as well. But more importantly, I think our redistricting system, it has major PR problems. It appears rigged. It may very well be rigged in some places, and that's not good for the health of our democracy, is we need some system that people can trust. And I think the Iowa system is a very good one, putting it in the hands of legislative staff. You still have the legislature have the final say over it, so there is some democratic accountability there. But I'll admit I'm a little biased. I'm a former staffer in Kentucky, so I think legislative staff are great people and do a good job. So I think that is, a good workable solution. But more importantly, regardless of who draws the line, it's focusing on the rules, finding some fair rules before the games start, right? We shouldn't let the players be deciding the rules in the middle of the game. Let these rules be there, and I don't think they should be based on what election outcomes, what happens on election day, but some type of representational link on the front end. And I think that, that is one way to try to limit the worst of gerrymandering. I don't think there's any way to completely stop it, but that's my sort of low-tech answer to some of the high-tech gerrymandering that we see going on today. All right? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks to both of you. I have been passed a message that it's a bit hard to hear. So can you guys hear me? Okay, I think I'm both loud and short enough to be close to the microphone. So I'll just encourage our speakers to maybe be very close to the microphone and speak in a really bold voice so that we can improve the acoustics, right, in the old room here. So I am not just being rude with my phone. I, in fact, have a whole list of questions pre-submitted by the U.S. Congress class here on campus, many of whom are in attendance tonight. They look so proud. I see them. But what I first want to ask is something that's been referred to by both of our speakers, and that's that the Supreme Court actually has a case within its possibilities that would actually overturn the use of partisan gerrymandering depending on how they ruled. So I was wondering if our speakers could comment on this case a little bit and why the Supreme Court hadn't found partisan gerrymandering in previous cases like in Texas. Oh, it's press the button, yeah.
There we go. The Supreme Court has always said that partisan gerrymandering is just that, it's part of politics, and they did not necessarily want to be in the business of getting involved in partisan gerrymanders. Racial gerrymanders, there is a several decade series of court precedents, but on the partisan side there are less so. In the last decade there were two cases, a case out of Texas and a case out of Pennsylvania, both again that the courts refused to find a standard, but Justice Kennedy did say, I'm open to a standard if you can show me something that is justiciable, that makes sense as far as an actual measure. So that became a challenge for a new generation of stats geeks and map makers. And there is a case that is now finding its way up to the court. They have to choose whether or not to hear it still, but it seems in all likelihood that they will. This is the Whitford case coming out of Wisconsin, which has been one of the most gerrymandered states in the country. And it is based on a standard called the efficiency gap, which is a mathematical theorem that some math professors and law professors came up with in order to try to find when partisan gerrymandering goes too far. And if you think about gerrymandering essentially as the art of wasting the other side's votes, either through packing all of those votes into one district, as you see in those Mississippi maps, or by cracking them and dividing them across a number of districts, the goal of the efficiency gap is to measure the amount of wasted votes, and if that number goes above a certain threshold, it's a signal to legislatures and the courts that it has gone too far. A three-judge panel, and that was a circuit court out of Wisconsin, found in favor of this standard, and they ordered all of Wisconsin's maps to be redrawn, all of their state legislative maps to be redrawn in time for the next election in 2018. And this could be heading to the court at any point in time. There's a couple of other interesting cases on partisan gerrymandering as well out of North Carolina and Maryland. It could be that the court groups a bunch of them together, but certainly there is new momentum on a partisan gerrymandering standard at the court that we haven't seen in at least a dozen years.
Yeah, I will add on that I believe it was an '86 case where the Supreme Court said that sure, partisan gerrymandering could be unconstitutional if we can find a standard, right? And traditionally over the years, the judges are not always keen on these mathematical formulas that are brought into the courts. This efficiency measure is not the first one that's been out there to try to measure partisan gerrymandering. The idea of wasted votes is, measuring that has been around for quite a while. So, and I was in Wisconsin last year testifying in the legislature on some of these issues, and this new efficiency measure has some momentum. I think the real question will be, the problem with any of those types of measures is you can find a statistician arguing one side of it and then someone else coming in and throwing up a bunch of numbers and formulas on the other side. Are the courts now ready to accept or willing to listen to and understand this type of measure, where in the past I think they've really just said, okay, yeah, we don't know what y'all are doing there, so we're not going to pay much attention to it.
I'm going to repeat the question so that the people on the tape can hear it. I'm going to paraphrase, if you're okay with that. That the question is, why is race kind of still a debated part of the redistricting process, given that, here in a state like Iowa, okay, there's hard to draw lines to fix something like that, or hard to make a way to address it with redistricting. But in some other states, this seems like something that should have been solved previously.
Well, I would say the need for it is still relevant and important. Look at the U.S. Senate. There's very few minorities in the U.S. Senate. And the racial gerrymandering in the House has essentially led to descriptive representation for African Americans. There's about roughly 10% or so of the U.S. House members are African American, about 13% of the U.S. population. So in that way, I would argue that it's been an important tool for increasing diversity over the years, and if we just took it away, you would see almost no minorities left in Congress. And I also think part of that is originally maybe the Democrats were using this as a segregation tool, but I don't know if that was really the case. I think they really saw it first as a way to, this can help us. We know we're going to get Democrats to win, and then it's, under the old VRA rules, you couldn't retrogress, right? So once you had a established majority-minority district, you had to have a very good reason to undo it. And that could change now moving forward with the court's ruling in Shelby. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I would argue that there's definitely still a need to consider race in the redistricting process, because of, I think, those benefits of having more diversity in Congress and in state legislatures is very important, and we've seen that these districts do promote that.
Let me just repeat the question. So he started with, he read it in the comment section, so it's clearly true. But questioning sort of the internal dynamics of the legislative process and how that contributes to polarization, especially as it relates to Newt Gingrich in the 1995 takeover of Congress. He mentioned some rules, such as Newt Gingrich separated the incoming freshmen when their orientation, required members to go home to their districts rather than staying in Washington, and that this partisan focus may have contributed to polarization in Congress, but that similar things could be happening in the states as well.
Let me take that on and also try to combine it a little bit with the question you were asking over here. I think that Gingrich is a really important player in a lot of this. Right after Gingrich takes over the House in 94, the lead of George Will's column in the Washington Post the next day was, "Gerrymandering is what got Newt Gingrich the Speaker's gavel." And I think that a big piece of this is what I'm probably not quite as charitable towards the Republicans on, in that I think that this was a really advertent strategy in order to rework and rewire, especially the southern states, and to To me, the 1990s leading into Gingrich is the first piece of a two-pronged strategy towards taking over the House of Representatives. You've got the 90s strategy, which is based around majority-minority seats, and then you have a piece of this in the 2010s that is red map. If you go back to 1989, George Bush is the first one is elected president, and his campaign manager, Lee Atwater, the good Southern, the South Carolina strategist, takes over the Republican National Committee, and his number one priority, he calls in a young lawyer named Ben Ginsberg, and he says to him, "We are going to do something about redistricting." And what Ginsberg comes up with is this idea of using the Voting Rights Act to create minority seats, and then as a result bleaching all of the surrounding seats. It certainly does drive up representation, and it also has the other, I think, entirely intentional consequence of bleaching all of the surrounding districts more white. And it leads to a very different kind of Congress. It leads to, when I was working on the book, I came down and had lunch with Jim Leach here, and he, talked a lot about Gingrich in those days. He said Gingrich insisted that folks not go to the Kennedy School for, it had been that every single time there was a new incoming class of freshmen, they would go off to the Kennedy School together and have an orientation, and put a stop even to that. And Leach, as someone who had been there, thought that all of those things mattered. When you're an office of 435 people, I mean, I would imagine that, sometimes that kind of collegiality and learning things about each other absolutely makes sense. But I think the other piece of what you're talking about here is what these gerrymandered legislatures do once they're in power. And what we have seen at the state level since 2010, 2011 on voting rights laws and voting restrictions, to me becomes another piece of this strategy. You begin to see now, I believe it's something like 25 states that have enacted serious new limitations on the vote since 2010. Most of those states, again, I say it not as a partisan, but because it's true, most of these states are the gerrymandered states that have super majorities of Republican voters, and they have passed, laws that have made it harder for other people to vote, which tend to be people who are not voting for their side.
John, you want to comment?
Yeah, I would just add a little bit on sort of your notion of these sort of informal norms of the collegiality of the members. I think there's definitely something to that. I don't know how much we can attribute to the fact that the, bipartisan softball leagues are falling apart in D.C. or whatever, but I think it matters. And your question on at the state level, that's a very good one. I don't know for sure on that because with the state legislatures, so many of these they're less professionalized. They don't spend as much time in the state capitol in a lot of states. So I'm not real sure how much those norms have shifted or changed recently at the state level, but I think that's actually an interesting question and something to think about in these state capitals. I've heard anecdotally that some states now try to tell their new members, well, don't share a room or don't share an apartment or whatever with someone from the other party, and stuff like that. I don't know how much of that's really going on, but I've heard some stories like that. So, I think those informal type relationships matter. I don't know how much it matters, but I think it definitely has to, right?
So the question is gerrymandering a natural result of our first past the post system or our sort of winner take all single districts?
Certainly if you had multi-member districts or ranked choice voting. I think a lot of those things become possible solutions. I don't know exactly how likely a lot of those solutions are, but they begin to become more popular. You see in Maine that they just passed ranked choice voting. We've had multi-member districts in the country before. They tended to go away largely, again, because there are issues around race and representation in these. The trouble is that in some ways all districting is gerrymandering. It is really hard to draw lines that do not have some degree of that don't give power to the line maker. Again, I think as a terrific solution becomes being really clear with the kind of criteria that map makers are allowed to use. There are certainly big picture democracy reforms that, like the ones you talk about, that I think could be very helpful. But in the time that it takes us to get to imagine those reforms coming into play, I think there are also real things we can do in closer elections.
Yeah, I would just add, I think it makes it easier, without a doubt. Having these single-member districts, but there's still several states that use some version of multi-member districts. A lot of the western states have sort of 2 House members per district. New Hampshire, Vermont have some districts that elect more than a handful of members from each of those, and I do think that is. Changing it up to going some sort of ranked choice voting or more multi-member districts would probably make some of the gerrymandering more difficult, but I'd also add, with the technology and as easy as it is to sort of hone in on very specific characteristics, that I don't know how much, I think the technological advances could in some ways catch up to any of those reforms, because they can just, all right, we got new rules, let's figure out how to slice it up now.
Just to repeat, she is a GIS student or teacher, I don't know which one, but asking about some of the sources to read about the efficiency standard that our experts referred to as the criterion in the Wisconsin case that might come up in the Supreme Court.
I'd be happy to, give me your email. I've got some great stories and interviews with people, and I can pass it along. It's an interesting standard. Again, it's imperfect, and all of these standards are imperfect. In some ways, all you can try to do is try to hem in the power of those who are drawing lines in order to try to keep them fair and honest and democratic. But in a lot of ways, the very technology that has contributed to this could help set us free of some of the absolute worst excesses of it as well. Whenever states do challenges, and students and other people go ahead and draw their own maps in so many of these states, they come out stronger on all of these important criteria. So when you are able to show that it really is possible to draw maps that are fair and equitable and that balance racial diversity needs and do a lot of things and still end up producing a more representative group of politicians, and when you can compare that to the maps that the politicians themselves draw, it's a really amazing contrast.
Well, I would just say that, same way, I'm happy to send you some of the sources on that. I believe there's been some folks in political science, their names have just left me, of course, because I'm on the spot, but that are doing things beyond some of these efficiency standards, are also doing with sort of the automation of redistricting that I think would probably be useful to you as well. But like I said, of course, I'm terrible with names. Ask my students. They just went out of my brain, so I apologize.
What a great question. He said, is 435 the right number of representatives for the United States, since we're stuck at that number?
No, I'd love to see a change there. I think any change there, though, becomes just as fraught as far as partisanship and everything else, it becomes, should Washington D.C. have, a senator, or some of these questions, it becomes a real question of partisan balance and fights that just make it impossible to imagine them actually doing anything about it. But I mean, it's been what, 100 years since they've actually monkeyed with, I think, the number of folks in the country is a whole lot bigger, and the number of people that each of these folks has to represent is more, and the limit on the number of representatives, I think, is certainly a big problem when it comes to drawing fair lines that actually represent people.
That 435 number is arbitrary, right? The size of the House grew throughout the 1800s into the early 1900s. Then around 1920 or so, they just sort of stopped increasing the number of seats. So it's not like that's some really well thought out number that we're at. I would say a couple of things on that is, one, if people don't like Congress now, just wait till we add a lot more. And two, a little bit more serious, the trend in the states, there's not a lot of change in the size of state legislatures, and the states are much different, right? They're much smaller than the country as a whole, but the trend over the last 20 or 30 years has been when legislatures change the size, they get smaller, not bigger. So we don't really have a lot of sort of good examples to say what would happen if we did all of a sudden grow the size of the U.S. House. Not to say it should or shouldn't happen, but I think that's sort of one of the things to think about there would be unintended consequences, once again, of what would the things we fix outweigh the things that we can't even really imagine how it's going to shift. So that's always an interesting debate, and one that I don't really know exactly how I feel or even think what's best for that, but I think that's always an interesting thing to think about as well.
To repeat the question, he asked about a different reform in California called the top two primary. This is a primary where the top two vote getters in the primary go to the general election, not the winner of the Democratic primary and the Republican primary. And he asked, what would the effect of that reform be in other places, and is that a good idea?
Well, it certainly could be. I think all of these ideas are really worth trying. I think we have a system that has really ossified in place, and it's fundamentally not working, in my opinion. So anything we can experiment with, especially at the state level, I mean, let's really use states as a laboratory and make them laboratories for democracy, and let's try a lot of these reforms and see how they work. I think, like all reforms, you have to sort of keep an eye on them, because the folks who have the most self-interest tend to find a way to game them. There's always unintended consequences. The campaign finance reforms of the 1970s end up leading to excesses that have to be curbed later on. It's whack-a-mole. You have to kind of find a new way to. Once you solve new problems, sometimes you create a bunch of other ones. But, I love the idea of trying top two, of trying ranked choice, of trying multi-member districts. Let's let 1,000 experiments bloom and see which ones work.
Yeah, I think the top two primary system is an interesting one. And for certain states, I think that could in some ways be effective. But I think regardless of the system, I think part of it is trying to get better candidates to want to run. So there might be some systems that encourage that more than others, some reforms one way or the other. So I think, part of it is thinking about not just the actual system in place, but how can we find a way to encourage stronger candidates to emerge, or even in some places, just any candidate to get on the ballot to offer some competition or, contested races. Top two primary might be a good solution in certain places, right? That may be more, Democrat or Republican across the state or whatever. So, yeah, I think along with any type of change to the system also has to be a way of encouraging people to actually go out and run for office.
I'd like to ask one that from the list that I got from the Congress class that I thought is sort of an interesting thing because I know we have a lot of students here tonight. One of the students, or actually a couple of the students, asked Mr. Daley to comment on how he got involved in being a political reporter and just to comment on how he got to this topic.
I wanted to become a reporter because I really liked the idea of trying to get answers to questions that I had, and having the excuse to go up to people and ask them was pretty cool. And in some ways, that's also what led to this book and this topic. I fundamentally did not understand what happened in 2012. I didn't understand how you could re-elect Barack Obama with the 334 electoral votes, how the Democrats could take back the Senate, but barely budged the House. It was 234, 201, and it turns out that there have not been very many times that the party with the most aggregate votes doesn't also take control of the chamber. So 2012 was pretty rare in this regard, and I was curious as to why, and I just kind of dug into why, and I kind of came across the Republican strategy and the consultants who kind of executed it, and as you look state by state, you begin to see the court trials and the transcripts and the public records and the emails that you can kind of dig through, and you see the pattern emerging, and you see what happened in each of these states, and it explained a lot to me, sort of about where our politics was, because it didn't make sense to me how, because clearly not having the House of Representatives made a huge difference on the second term of Barack Obama. In many ways, the domestic agenda stalled and was over on election night in 2010. And the fact that he probably should have had the Congress back in 2012 and then lost it in 2014 is a thing of no small significance.
To repeat the question, this is related to an interview that Mr. Daley did yesterday on River to River, and asking the question, okay, if this is the situation, what does the map look like for Democrats to get a seat at the table or to start to make gains back, given the changes in the rules? And it didn't sound optimistic, so could he comment on that?
I am a pessimist on this topic, but I think I'm a realist on this topic as well. I think the Democrats as a party for a long time have focused on nothing really but the presidency, and they really neglected down ballot. At the same time that the Republicans realized the importance of it and invested in it and built an infrastructure while the Democrats fell asleep. And this has had far-reaching consequences, and it's contributed to the lack of a Democratic bench in a lot of these states and a lot of good candidates coming up through pipelines. What you have to understand is that every state handles this process differently. And I keep focusing on sort of the handful of states across the Midwest and the Rust Belt and a couple of southern states that are turning bluish purple, like Virginia and a state like North Carolina, which I guess could still be going either way. But when you look at these states, if the Democrats want to make inroads in the House of Representatives, they have to find a way to narrow the Republican advantage in those delegations in all of those states, which means they then have to understand how those lines are drawn and by who. It's different in each of these states. So in Pennsylvania, you have the two houses of the legislature draw them, and the governor has veto power. It's the same thing in Michigan. It's the same thing in Wisconsin. It's the same thing in Virginia and Florida. All of those houses right now are under dramatic Republican control. In many states right now, Michigan, Virginia among them. Democratic candidates get more votes. Republicans still hold often super majorities in these states. So to imagine the kind of Democratic wave that would be required to flip these states in 2018 and 2020, it seems very, very difficult to me. I try not to be in the prediction business, especially now, because, you know. But if you just look at these numbers, they are really, really daunting. So an easier road to having a seat at the table, if you're a Democrat looking to get fairer maps, would be to say, okay, where can I have some influence on this process? Where's there a pressure point I can come in at? Oh, I could win one statewide governor's race. You know, it's hard to gerrymander a governor's race. You know, I still think that these voter ID and other laws do drive down turnout in these ways, in ways that disproportionately affect the Republicans. But you can, if you are a Democrat looking to influence these maps in these key states, it's going to be a whole lot easier to win one governor's race and then to have the chance to veto these maps or to keep the other party from not being transparent, or to have the chance to kick them into the courts where you usually end up getting fairer maps. And those states are the whole ball of wax because, you know, right now it's a 2-to-1 ratio. This is not to say that Democrats shouldn't fight in all of these states and run candidates, but they ought to understand the steepness of the hill they're running up and to place smart bets with their money and their resources.
Okay, I'm going to read the question because I now think I know which question you wrote. Based on the article, you seem to know a lot about Wisconsin specifically. I'm from Racine, which is Paul Ryan's district, and I worked indirectly with the 2012 challenger Rob Zerman. Am I right? Yeah, okay. From day one, it was absolutely crystal clear that Zerman had no shot in heck of winning. Wisconsin's first district cracks a lot of votes away from the Milwaukee area. Is this why Paul Ryan is so untouchable? Or is it really, as one local supporter told me, those baby blue eyes? That's the written question.
I think it's the baby blue eyes. Yeah. Wisconsin is a very gerrymandered state. That the folks who came up with this efficiency gap standard, they measured, if you use their standard and apply it to sort of every race in America over the last 30 years, I believe they found that a bunch of the ones in Wisconsin over the course of the last decade are all in the top 10. So what you have is, you know, an assembly that has a greater Republican control than at any point in time since the early 1950s, even though the number of votes is fairly evenly divided between the two parties. I mean, at the congressional level, it's a 5-3 Republican advantage, which you're never going to have a perfect you know, symmetry of votes to seats. So, I mean, 5-3, I think, even would probably fall within the standards of the efficiency gap. It's you know, it could be 4-4 or it could be 5-3 either way, and you probably wouldn't, you know, have much to argue about there. But as far as the State House and State Senate lines go, those lines are rigged about as hard as they can be, and the court has ordered that there be, you know, new maps drawn by November 1st of this year for their approval that are then in place for November of 2018, and that is a pretty rare thing to have a court come in and say that, you know, these lines are making a mockery out of constitutional democracy, and you have to do a mid-decade redraw. It doesn't happen that often, so that it's happening now, and that this standard could, you know, finally, you know, bring some kind of new measuring tool that at least limits and sets boundaries seems to me to be useful. I don't think it is the entire win, and I'm sure people will find a way around it, but it would be great to have, I think, to at least have the courts say that this is important, this has gone too far, and we're going to tell you when it's gone too far.
All right, well, I want to thank you very much for coming. I know this is a somewhat depressing evening, but at the same time, it encourages us to think about this kind of public policy. So thank you very much.